in your criticism of the indie is that this is not a scale that you think can be used for all marginalized groups, which now gets us into the issue about, do we then need intersectional measures for specific, to address, to use Kimberly Crenshaw's language, the specific and particular concerns of each group? Talk about just your view on that.
Oh, yeah, that's a very good point. A very good question, Lisa. Well, I think there are two major approaches to developing measures of discrimination to date. The first one is to develop specific scales for specific groups, right? For example, suppose you want to measure discrimination among middle-aged Black women in the US. Then you would come up with a set of items that would reflect these women experiences with discrimination, and you would assess the performance of this instrument among this specific group, right? So this is one specific approach to developing scales of discrimination. The other one is to come up with a set of items that reflects experiences with discrimination that are shared among marginalized groups. So you would focus on specific experiences that are common to different groups in society, right? And I think both strategies, both approaches have pros and cons, but I am more inclined to develop measures that focus on items which reflect shared experiences among different groups. Even though that might mean that some specificities might be lost and some error might be introduced into the measure, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'm interested, and I think, and this is a conversation I'm going to invite everybody to join, because I think I'm interested in sort of the intra-categorical measurements, because I think that the loss of those things, those specific experiences, can be so salient. I'm thinking about, like, so to use your example with like Black middle-aged women, of which I am one, in the US, and I'm thinking about hair, right? And the way that Black women are discriminated in the workplace around, particularly if they have natural hair, and how that's an experience that I think shared, people be like, hair, that's the most like minimal thing you could think of. But in terms of a salient source of discrimination that has such an impact across the lifespan, and so that's something that you would miss in developing a measure for everybody. And of course, it depends on what your goal is, right? What your outcome. But as somebody who's interested in research on Black people in the US, that's why I'm so interested in the specificity. And so I very much like the idea of developing measures on the specific group that you're interested in. But it depends on what your goals are. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I agree with that. But if we choose to follow the first approach, which is the one you just talked about, then I think one step ahead would be to try and come up with different scales, which would be used among different social groups. But we would have to make sure that these scales are equivalent in some way to one another, right? So that we can compare the results of these scales and establish, comparisons, right? So there are many statistical approaches to check whether equivalence is taking place among scales. We can use these approaches, these techniques, and I think that we need to do that. Otherwise, we cannot be 100% sure that a score of 5 in one scale means the same thing as a score of 5 in a different scale, right? So, and that's a thing in quantitative research. You try to quantify social processes, and you try to establish comparisons between groups and studies. So comparability is a very important issue in quantitative analysis. And this is kind of conflicting especially when it comes to adopting an intersectional perspective, because intersectionality is about contextual specificity, right? So how can you value specificity on one hand and try to come up with universal measurements on the other hand, right? It's kind of it's a tricky situation. It's like being between the rock and a hard place, right?